So welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Hamilton. I'm the Director of Public History here at Western, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Steven Lubar, who's going to be with us at Western for 2 days, today and tomorrow. And I'd like to thank our supporters for the 2 days, the Macintosh Gallery, the Department of Visual Arts, and the History of Medicine, Public History, American Studies, and Public Humanities programs. While I have you here captive, I want to say a few things about tomorrow night before we get to tonight's talk. Tomorrow will be a very different kind of event. Josh Lamy and I have called it a public dialogue, in which we're really hoping for, there will be 4 people on a panel, Stephen, myself, Brian, who's in the back there, and I'm not sure if Patrick Mann is here or not, from Visual Arts. And we will have a few things to say about how communities, arts and heritage communities, galleries and campuses can work together, the challenges, the barriers, the opportunities, maybe some models. But then we really do hope that it's a public dialogue where people ask us questions or talk to each other or come up with other fabulous things they've tried, or even, dare I say it, things that sounded fabulous and then failed utterly, but you learned lessons from, and so on. So about tonight, Steven Lubar is a Guggenheim Fellow, Professor of History, American Studies, and the History of Art and Architecture at Brown University in Rhode Island. Between 2004 and 2014, he served as Director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. He has worked extensively at numerous prestigious museums in the United States, most notably probably the National Museum of American History, which is part of the Smithsonian. He is a prolific and award-winning author. I will mention just 2 books because they seem particularly relevant to the talk tonight. One of them is called Legacies: Collecting America's History at the Smithsonian, and the other is called History from Things, which is a reader and material culture which is widely used across North America as an introduction to material culture studies at universities in many interdisciplinary departments. So this evening, Professor Lubar will be speaking about his new book, which is called Finding the Lost Museum, soon to be published by Harvard University Press. And his talk tonight, entitled Seen Through the Skiascope, comes from a part of that book. So please join me in welcoming Steven Lubar.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank you very much for the invitation for all those various parts of the university that have supported me coming up here. It's been a delight to be here. I'm looking forward to 2 days of finding out what's going on and talking about all of the interesting work of public history and public humanities. My talk today is called Looking Through the Skiascope. It's, like Michelle says, it's a piece, to some extent it's a chapter, a piece from the book I'm working on, which has a new title. I'm still playing with the title. It's now Lessons from the Lost Museum. The notion is, it's really an introduction to museums and museum work done through the history of museums. And in that book, it's mostly finished, but there are a few stories that I just can't let go of. And I've written way more than I can possibly put in the book, but the Skiascope is one of them. I guess you'd call it Mr. Gilman's Skiascope. The other project that I'm absolutely fascinated by right now is a 19th century collector of mice who collected mice for the Smithsonian and hired all of his students to collect mice for the Smithsonian. But that's another talk. So today's the art side of things, that's the natural history side. So the talk today is about a fellow named Benjamin Ives Gilman, who had the title of Secretary of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. In 1917, when he was really one of the most distinguished, one of the most important what they called museum men in the country. He was one of the founders of the American Association of Museums. And in 1917, he went and gave a talk at the AAM in New York City. And his talk was about his new device, the Skiascope. Gilman would have been a big draw at that meeting. He was not only a practical museum man, but he was also the the foremost proponent of the idea that museums were places for aesthetic experience. When you hear about a museum as temple, that's his language. That's where he's coming from. So you can imagine him taking the stage. He's described at this point in his life as a lean, gentle, gray-bearded scholar. He's fastidiously dressed, and he's carrying in his hand this device you can see up there. It's a small box. It's made out of wood and wire and black flannel. And he would have held it to his eyes, just like you see there, and looked at an imaginary painting on the wall, the opposite wall. And what he said in his talk is that in the future, museum visitors would carry the skiascope with them in the museum, or they'd pick it up from a hook at the entrance to each gallery, and they would look at the sculptures and the paintings through the skiascope, and they would see them better. Now, what he meant by better was something very particular. What he meant was a particular kind of aestheticized vision. It was pure, more abstracted, less historical, less contextual. I'll come back to what that means at the end of the talk. So Gilman explained his skiascope to that AAM meeting in 1917 in three different ways. First, he says, he gives the etymology of it. He says that the skiascope comes from the Greek. It means shadow seer. I should say here that if those of you who are in medical history may have come across something called the skiascope, which is completely different medical instrument, but no relation. So it's a shadow seer. It allows you to see into shadows. Next, he gave a very practical definition. The skiascope uses looking from shadow as a means of looking into shadow. That is, you shade your eyes and you can see shadow better. And then, basically, it would block the glare. It would let you see things better. And finally, he gives an explanation that is both practical and philosophical at the same time. And so I want you to read this two ways. For good seeing, it is more important that the eyes should be sufficiently shaded than that the object should be abundantly lighted. So at one level, that's just a description of museum lighting technique. At another level, I think it's what it means to shade the eyes or to shade the mind, to shade the way we look at things is more important than what you say about the object on the wall, what you say about the painting. So it's both a description of museum lighting and it's also advice for the museum visitor. It's the responsibility of the visitor to know how to look rather than the responsibility of the museum to explain. Lighting both practical and philosophically. Gilman's practical explanation for the skiascope was that it would allow museums to deal with glare. If you had your paintings, if you had galleries with big windows, if you had galleries with skylights, it was very hard to see the paintings that were close to those windows, that were close to those skylights. And you'd be able to hang them closer. Let me show you some pictures of the galleries at the new Museum of Fine Arts. When Gilman wrote this, museum had just moved to this new building. Lots of galleries, the center's ones with skylights, galleries with windows, again, all these things that have disappeared from the modern museum. This is what some of the galleries would have looked like. The walls were full of art. They were hung ceiling to floor, many rows. This is a typical museum gallery of this period. And really up until the 1920s, this is what museum galleries look like. Think about lighting in this gallery. You have skylights. This one doesn't have windows, but if it did, you can just imagine the problems. So the skiascope would block the glare and let you see the paintings near the ceiling better. But more than that, it blocked everything else as well. Gilman had strong feelings about museums, and he wrote a wonderful 400-page book called Museum Ideals of Purpose and Method. Like I say, he believed that museum was a temple. The distinctive goal of an art museum, he writes in that book, is that it should provide a place for the perfect contemplation of works of art. You should be able to see the art. Nothing should get in the way between you and the art. The perfect contemplation of works of art. That's his goal for museums. Museum, and he writes further, museum is a place for the use of the eyes. That's a metaphor that goes back a long ways in museums, but well, 50 years before that was a controversial thing to have said. By 1920, people agreed this was a place for looking. So if you want to get rid of anything that blocks the pure, simple looking at art, that's what he wants. So how do you do that? First of all, no labels on the wall. He really hates labels. He has this wonderful line, they interpose a rush of abstract historical ideas and even indifferent registration data between the visitor's perception and the artist's intentions. He wanted the walls to be all one color. This was pre-white walls. He had put a lot of thought into the right color of greenish gray that would be perfectly neutral for paintings for the wall. You don't want anything to get between the visitor and the art. So that's what the Skiascope that's where the Skiascope is coming from. That's where his philosophy of museums that the Skiascope tries to address. I want to ask two questions about the Skiascope today. The first one is, where did Gilman get these ideas about the museum as a place for the perfect contemplation of art? Where did his ideas about the right way to view art come from? I'm going to try to approach that as a biographical question. Where did Gilman get those ideas? And then the second question is, what effect did the Skiascope have? More precisely, what effect did the skiascopic way of looking have in the history of museums? And how does it shape museums today? So let me start with Benjamin Ives Gilman. There's almost nothing written about him, which I find sort of remarkable. The more that I've looked into him, the more interesting he is. So this is Mr. Gilman. On the left, there is a photograph that, in fact, I found today at the airport on Wi-Fi that finally tracked it down. Probably, and then on the right there is a photograph, is a doodle drawn by one of his professors at Johns Hopkins in class. So I think he's sleeping in class there. He's born in 1852 in New York City, went to Williams College, class of 1872, but didn't graduate because of health problems. He went into his father's banking business in New York City. And then in about 1880, he went to attend Johns Hopkins University, which was at that point just starting up as really the first graduate school in the country, probably the best graduate school in the country at that point. His fellow students at Johns Hopkins in that year included John Dewey and Thorstein Veblen, sort of two of the most important philosophers and economists and psychologists of the day. He enrolled as a philosophy student focusing on mathematics. And through the wonders of university archives, this is his letter of application saying, I'd like to come study here. He studied with Charles Sanders Peirce, who was probably the premier mathematician in the country at that time, and took math courses. So he did not go to study history of art. This is his list of courses that he takes. You can see very serious math. He actually, as a graduate student, publishes in a volume edited by Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce is the one who drew that sketch of Gilman. So the question is, how did he get from mathematics, from calculus and probability, to paintings and sculpture? And the answer seems to be through music. Remember, he entered the philosophy department, and philosophy in the 1880s was a very, very broad field. It could be mathematics and logic, like what Peirce did and what Gilman went to do. But it could also be ethics. It could also be what we now call psychology. In the philosophy department at Johns Hopkins, along with Peirce, was G. Stanley Hall, who would go on to become probably the most important psychologist of early 20th century America. He had specialized in educational theory, and it seems like what happened is that in this philosophy department, where he had gone to study mathematics, he decided to study psychology instead. He left Hopkins to study at the University of Berlin with Helmholtz, who had just written a big book on music, and that seems to be the field that Gilman turned to. So Gilman never finished his PhD at Hopkins. He studied at University of Berlin for a little while. He studied at Harvard for a little while. But mostly, he was an adjunct at a bunch of universities around the country. Not the language back then. He was called an instructor. But basically, he adjuncted, gave lectures at Colorado, Princeton, Harvard, Columbia. His field was combining science and music. So this is lectures that he gave at Colorado. You can get a sense of, it's called the aesthetics of music, but it's very much a technical kind of aesthetics. It's not till the very end here that you get to expression. The purpose of this course, is, according to the syllabus that he published, is to inquire into the operations of the mind concerned in the hearing of music. He talked about the sensations of tone, the quality of musical notes, the natures of consonance and dissonance, and the last lecture was the general power music has over the soul. But science came first, aesthetics second. So in 1892, after spending about 10 years as a lecturer at various universities and giving these talks about music, he's appointed as a lecturer, as an instructor in psychology at Clark University. Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts was another one of these late 19th century graduate schools. That was, for a time, again, one of the most important. Here he continued to write about music, to lecture on psychology, and he started to do what he called experimental music studies. What he claimed was the first experimental attempt ever made to reach exacter notions of expressiveness in music. So what he did is, you can see here, this is the experimental concert. He gave a concert, violin and piano, and he asked all of the visitors to fill out forms. What did they hear? What did they think? What emotions did it evoke? This is still cited as the origins of the field. So his work in mathematics is still cited in mathematics for a long time. His work in musicology and soon ethnomusicology is still cited. Nobody has ever pulled together the fact that this is the same person as the fellow who did his work in museums. He also began to study what he called primitive music and made the very first analysis of primitive music based on phonograph recordings. He wrote about native tribes in Maine. He went to the 1893 Columbian Exposition with his phonograph machine and recorded 100 cylinders of music of the Samoan and Turkish and Fijian and native peoples on display. He even went to New York City, to Chinatown, to record Chinese music. What he would do is analyze the music. This is from his book on Hopi music. He would write out the notes that he heard listening to the recordings he made. He also offered a course at Clark called The Psychology of Pain and Pleasure and published his notes for us. So we can get a pretty good sense of the way he thought about psychology. Mostly science, it's Darwin, it's Humboldt, very occasionally literature and the arts. It's in this psychology that we can start to see why he thought museums should be the way that he wanted them to be, this purely aesthetic sense. Music, says Gilman, is the queen of the arts, imposing the inward laws by which all rule themselves. That is, if you understand music, you can understand the other arts. Art constantly aspires toward the condition of music, he wrote. Music is pure, music is intense. And he applies this idea about music, the idea that music is pure, to all of the other arts. Art which is most like music, which has a well-defined structure, is the best kind of art. Beauty is based on form. Beauty in paintings, beauty in art is based on form. In fact, he describes paintings as using terms like tone, pitch, harmony, and key. He wants to see those musical ideas in all of the arts. His explanations for why we appreciate art, why we appreciate beauty, come pretty close to being biological. He writes things like, sensations from light waves are in general pleasant, and it is natural to assign as the cause of this fact the uniformity of the physical process in which they originate. Or something like, the aesthetic superiority of curved outlines has been ascribed to feelings of the motion of the eye involved in following them. So it's sort of made up science, but you can see what he's getting at. He's getting at a purity of all the arts based on what he sees as the purity of music. He does mention that Darwin notes that we like art that is familiar, but that's secondary to it. Form comes first, culture is secondary. He also writes a little bit about what the best way is to view art. This is again in this 1890s book before he goes to work at the museum. The state of aesthetic contemplation is fundamentally a hypnotic condition, he writes. That is one of passivity and narrowed consciousness. Art allows the viewer to forget himself in the beauty presented to its contemplation. So visual arts based on the contemplation of music. The perfect way of understanding art is the same way you would understand music, complete focus on just the music. So 1893, he publishes this syllabus of his course. He publishes his book on music, and he desperately wants a permanent job at Clark. At the same time, though, he's offered a job as curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Now, he had never studied art, as far as I can tell, but he says that he had done a little cataloging for the museum. And he had a hard time deciding what he should do. Should he stay in academia, or should he go into what we now call public humanities work? Luckily, he wrote a very long letter, actually 2 long letters, to his cousin, Daniel Gilman, who happened to be president of Johns Hopkins University, asking for his advice, outlining all of the pluses and minuses of the 2 kinds of work that he could have imagined doing. So he was hopeful Clark would give him a full-time job, but he wondered whether he could do the intellectual work he really wanted if he were as a curator, if he took the job as curator. The director of the Museum of Fine Arts, who had wanted to hire him, gave what I think is just a hilariously contemporary statement to him. He says, there is, of course, some routine, but you'd have plenty of time to do your scholarly work and to write catalogs. Gilman wasn't convinced. His cousin, the president of Johns Hopkins, gave him, I have to admit, the sort of advice that I have given students. Well, what fields needs you? What field do you think you offer the most? What field will you get the most out of? So basically he says, do what you want. Gilman did take the job at the MFA, and he stayed there for the next 32 years, retiring in 1925. He continued to publish on a very wide range of topics. You can see here, this just sort of gives you a sense of the range of things he worked on, and also the timing. So he publishes his mathematics as a student, his music and psychology when he's desperately trying to get this job at Clark. He does a few museum reports in the early 20th century, but it takes him 15 years after he begins working at the museum before he starts to really publish his other work, even to publish the work he had done on music 15 years earlier. And then what's so fascinating is that he proceeds in both towards the end of his time at the museum and after he retires to write on an astonishing array of topics, everything from relativity to liberty, to the death penalty. He writes about Dante. Again, it's sort of a remarkable range that he does, but it takes him a long time before he does that. So to sum up Gilman, he was a mathematician first, a psychologist, a musicologist, and I think he combined all of those into his work at the museum. You can see that training in music, in philosophy, in psychology, in what he did as a curator. So let me talk now about skiascopic vision and where that fits in. So Gilman says the museum should be about direct engagement with the art, and that the museum and the skiascope would allow you to have that direct engagement for the art. I have to admit I was skeptical. I had never heard of the skiascope. Almost nobody's heard of the skiascope. But I wanted to give it a try. So I thought what I would do is call up the Museum of Fine Arts and say, have you got any skiascope? Do you still have one? And I'd visit and I'd see what it was like. There seemed like there was a lot to be gained from this. The chapter of the book after the skiascope, after you have the skiascopic vision down, is called The Ideal of Restful Inspection. Seemed ideal, so I should try that. Now, as far as I can tell, there's not a single skiascope anywhere, Gilman skiascope. Either they were never made or they didn't survive. I've called a bunch of museums, I've looked on eBay, all the places you might imagine. But Gilman gives, in this big philosophical tome, very oddly, he gives detailed instructions on how to make one. It's very odd to have these kind of instructions in a book. So I decided that I would build a skiascope, the first skiascope in 100 years. It took a while because I'm not that good with this kind of construction, but you take some pieces of wood and you take some wire and some black flannel and you bend them all together. While the instructions are pretty detailed, I think what Gilman really meant was give these instructions to your museum shop and they'll make one for you. I don't think he meant that I could make one. Anyway, I did go ahead and put it all together following the instructions and made myself a skiascope. So this is a modern skiascope. See you all in there. And you're welcome to come up and try it at the end. As soon as I had made it, a couple of things became clear. Again, material culture question, having the real thing in your hands, especially an instrument, really is different from looking at a picture of one. First thing that's clear, and this is true of any sort of instrument, it's not a passive thing. In fact, you can control it. It's designed so that you can change the way, what you see through it. It takes some practice to figure out how to use it. Again, this shouldn't be a surprise. So what I thought I would do is take this to a gallery, one that looks like the galleries that Gilman was used to. There's the skiascope. And like Gilman, give it a try. So here's what Gilman says you'll see when you look through it. Let's see. So this is the gallery I took it to. This is the RISD Rhode Island School of Design Museum. They had recently rehung this gallery in more or less a 19th century style. You can see the skylight. You can see the paintings are stacked on the walls. This is the kind of gallery that the skiascope was designed for. And here's what you'll see, according to Gilman, when you raise the skiascope. Raising it to the eyes in a top-lighted gallery, like this, a noticeably deeper tone spreads over the picture, and accentuated lights and shadows appear on the sculptures. The skiascope, he says, will block out the extraneous light that robs the canvases and marbles of a share of their designed effectiveness. And it turns out that's a pretty accurate description, but not as revealing as it might be. The first thing you see when you look through a skiascope is, in fact, greater contrast within the painting, a deeper tone, a sense of a wider range of tones. And that's pretty clear why that's happening. You don't see any light around the painting, and just what you see is just the light directly reflected from it, so you don't have to worry about the contrast, the brighter walls around it. Glare is reduced. You don't have glare, and so you let you focus on just the light coming from the painting. So that seems fair, and that makes sense. But what was so interesting to me, and something that Gilman doesn't say, is that the paintings appear to have greater depth. What's not at all clear from any description of the skiascope, and it isn't clear until you actually make it, and you can see here, there's cloth on either side, but down the center, there's also cloth. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a piece of cloth right down the center here. And that septum between the eyes, what that does is eliminates binocular vision. Basically, your eyes are focusing separately. It's like looking through two tubes at the same time. So I was curious about this. I didn't really understand why it had that effect. And so I asked a professor of ophthalmology at Brown to take a look and tell me what was going on here. And here's his explanation briefly, is that when you look at a scene, your eyes use their binocular vision to understand the depth of it. When you look at a painting, there's no real depth. There's only the fake depth that's painted by the painter, that's painted by the artist. So you don't have, your eyes are confused by those two cues. On the one hand, it's flat. On the other hand, it looks like it's not flat. The skiascope eliminates the flatness of the painting, and you have a more compelling sense of depth from it. So briefly, to give you a sense of what I saw from it, things that had a false sense of depth to them, a sense of depth, like this painting where you have a family in the foreground, you have a scene behind them, you get an accentuated sense of the separation of space. The bust here on the right side, it really pops when you look through the skiascope. Again, it's this false perspective that seems more real because you don't see that it's flat. Again, paintings that had a forced perspective like this one, you get a greater sense of interior space. Sculpture gives a very different sense. In a modern sculpture gallery where the lighting is even and perfect all around, it doesn't have much effect. But in a gallery like this one at the Rijksmuseum that has some exterior lights and bright lights from one side, the shadows are stronger, the art is more dramatic. The most important thing, though, is the kind of concentration and focus that the skiascope encouraged. So Gilman writes that it encourages a good seeing. And to some extent, that good seeing comes because you're seeing differently. You sort of have to focus on what you're looking at. In part, it's that it narrows your field of view. You can only see one thing at a time. And in a room like this, instead of being distracted by a lot of things, you're looking through these tubes and you're seeing only one thing at a time. So Gilman is right at some level. More focused seeing, the appearance of the art is better, less glare, more three-dimensionality. You pay closer attention. But there's a trade-off with that. You also are limited in what you can see. Both physically and metaphorically, the skiascope encapsulates what Gilman wanted to see in a museum. It's his philosophy of vision in a machine. The artwork is separated from everything around it. The visitor is separated from the other visitors in the museum. If you imagine a room where everybody is just looking through a tube through a skiascope at the art on the wall, it's a more personal, less social experience. In some ways, it's comparable to listening to music through headphones rather than in a concert hall. It seems, like I say, that the skiascope never took off. There's no mention of it in the literature of the day other than what Gilman wrote. I've never seen a picture of the skiascope in use other than that one in Gilman's book. But what I want to suggest, and this is sort of now moving from the skiascope to the art museum more generally, is that the mode of vision, the way of looking at art that Gilman wanted Gilman shaped through the Skiascope was in fact a success. The Skiascope was a failure. It wasn't necessary because Gilman and his successors figured out how to get the same results without giving everyone a Skiascope. He reorganized the museum gallery to make it so that a museum visitor was strongly encouraged to interact with a painting in exactly the way that Gilman thought best, in the same way that you would look at it through a Skiascope. So this is what some pre-Gilman galleries look like. A little bit dark, but you can see walls covered with paintings. Busy, crowded places. Paintings hung all the way up to the ceiling. Now compare that with the sorts of galleries that we're used to today. White walls, or single color walls. Everything is lined up in the order that the curator wants us to see it. There's always space between the paintings. You don't need a Skiascope because each one is there on its own. There's only one way to interact with a painting, what you might call the museum gaze. Remember, Gilman said a museum is a place for the use of the eyes, and that's what contemporary art museums are set up to do. The white box gallery, like the Skiascope, banishes art to a timeless aesthetic realm. The white cube takes the art out of any context other than being about art, other than being about the art museum. Remember, Gilman talks about the museum as a temple. This is how museums become temples. Art is there for us to gaze at. So there's another thing that happens at the same time that is also shaped by the skiascopic vision. Remember those paintings, all those paintings in those galleries, packed full of them? What happens to all those paintings when you say all we want is a single row of paintings, evenly spaced with lots of room around them? In 19th century museums, most museums put all of their art on display. They put the best art at eye level, called on the line, and the really bad art was up high, and it was called skying. So if you went into a gallery, you saw, oh, that's been skied, the bad stuff's up high. But it was all there. At about this time, what happens is you take all of that extra art, which no longer fits in the simple story of a single row of art on the wall, and you put it at first into what's called a study collection. So many museums, Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, sets up the galleries with the best art, nicely arranged as the curator wants you to see it, and then open to the public, not storage, but available to anyone, was another room packed full of paintings on all the walls, where all the not so good stuff was. That's the other half of the skiascopic vision, is that you just look at the art that the museum wants you to see. In a big museum today, 90 or 95% of the art is in storage. So skiascopic vision requires a focus not just on the part of the visitor, but also on the part of the museum. So let me conclude by asking this question. Is skiascopic vision a good thing? What is lost and what is gained when we limit our interactions in the museum to this purely visual way, when it's just us and the art? Might there be more ways to appreciate art than just the visual, in more ways than just the aesthetic, in a more free form or a more social way, in a way that opens art up to the rest of the world rather than insisting that art is separate from the world and on its own and to be appreciated individually? So, give you a quick detour into literature. Just about the same time that Gilman is working at the MFA and thinking about how to best present art, Henry James writes The Golden Ball, a novel about an American millionaire art collector who decides that he's going to build a museum for the American people. Positively civilization condensed, a receptacle of treasures sifted to positive sanctity, sort of language that Gilman would have appreciated. They would all be authentic objects, they would civilize America. So he buys paintings so he can build this museum, and Americans might study it deeply and learn from it. He would have approved of Gilman's skiascope, for his own vision was narrowed and sharpened in just that way. Adam's daughter, Maggie, in the novel, sees art very differently. There's Stephen Arata, who's a scholar who writes about this novel, says that she rejects her father's narrow, objectifying way of looking at art, what Arata calls a skiascopic vision of art, in favor of a more encompassing vision. The metaphor that Arata uses for the skiascope is blinders, which I don't think is quite fair, but there's certainly something to that. What happens to Maggie in the Golden Bowl, he suggests, is that she moves from skiascopic looking to penetrative looking. That is, uses art to awaken the historical imagination. It's not just about the art, it's about the culture more generally. The artifacts are shifted from a timeless aesthetic realm and put back into their historic and cultural contexts. Art for Maggie in the novel is valued not for itself, but for its culture. So this dichotomy between the art as pure aesthetics, Gilman's idea coming out of music, and art as part of history is a key part of the debate about what museums should do in the early 20th century. The skiascope failed, but the skiascopic vision triumphed. But as the debate in the Golden Bowl suggests, as that contrast suggests, something was lost. So I enjoyed my visit to the RISD Museum with the skiascope, and I did see paintings better than I had before. I understood by doing that a bit of what that transition to the modern museum might have felt like. But did I lose something as well? What's lost when we limit our interactions in the museum so that it's just us and the art? Is there a way that we can use the art not only on its own terms, but more generally to understand the world? How might we redesign the museum so that it doesn't offer the skiascopic vision, but something that's a broader vision? Thanks very much.
Just before we take questions, I have one thing to announce that concludes our night. James Patton at Macintosh Gallery has provided food and drinks for everybody who comes from here, gratis, over to Macintosh Gallery, which is just a short walk away. If you don't know where it is, you can follow through, but I assume most people here do know where the Macintosh Gallery is. So I encourage and exhort everybody after we're finished to come have a drink, come have some food, and maybe if you're lucky, you can look through the skiascope at some of the work that's on the walls in Macintosh Gallery. So does anybody have questions for Steven, which was a fantastic talk?
I was wondering if there was any direct or any relationship that you discovered between stereoscopes, and which is a popular way of looking at photographs.
Yeah. That's a good question. And you can imagine that it comes out of the same sense of closely looking. I think, though, that it's a separate, this doesn't come, I mean, it's the same idea that you're looking into a small device, but you're looking through it rather than at an image stuck onto the end of it. When I was in the museum playing with this, the assumption that everybody had was it was some sort of virtual reality thing. Because it sort of has that feel, that it's you're looking through goggles. But I think it's the opposite of virtual reality in some ways. Again, the notion here is making the real more real. The stereoscope and the virtual reality is sort of making the fake seem real. So they're related, but I'm sure that the idea of looking into an optical device, was around, and he certainly would have known about it. But I think that the end result is a different result. Yeah.
And also those sort of film boom technologies you use at Nickelodeon to improve your face.
That's right.
And it sort of recruits the whole body as an object of vision.
Yeah. There are lots of these optical devices, which I guess explains why Gilman would say the way to make this happen is with an optical device. Yeah.
I think they started collecting furniture and some objects around the 20,
Right.
20, right?
Right.
Did Gilman ever write about that? In my head, when you were talking about his sort of ideas of aesthetics, I imagine you taking time.
Yes, I think it probably would have. So the Met collects European art, European decorative arts earlier. The American decorative arts, which had always been considered very inferior, really had to fight their way into the museums. Gilman would not have, I don't remember anything where he talks directly about it, but he really sees paintings as what museums should do. And he believes in connoisseurship and expertise, and that's what he brings to the museum. The Museum of Fine Arts had big battles over collecting things other than paintings. It originally had lots of plaster casts, like most American art museums did, and he got rid of all of those. He wasn't interested in those. Big debate over collecting Greek crystals, which he wanted to collect even though they were hard. The public didn't care about them. I should say that Gilman, at the same time as he believed in expertise, he also, in some ways, was very modern he wanted the museum to be open to the kids from local schools. He invented the notion of docents in museums. So he wants people to get there, but he wants them to see things the way he sees them. Yeah.
What's his relationship to abstract painting? And a lot of what you talked about in relationship to music, but also the time period that he was working in, would suggest that he'd be an early adopter.
You would think that he does not write about it at all. Now, partly he's just at the beginning. He leaves the museum in 1925, and museums at that point, most American museums are not collecting abstract art at all. Impressionism is even sort of on the fringes for them. But it is a good question. You would think that would be very appealing to him, but I have not come across any writing about that. The other thing is that by that time he's really an administrator more than a curator. So the records that are at the Museum of Fine Arts are basically his records of him running the staff meetings. There's very little about collecting, so he's not talking about art by that point. But it's an excellent question, because you would think that the psychological appeal of the pure form would fit nicely with him. And that's something I should explore.
Was there ever a dialogue between Gilman and artists at the time on how the artists received its instrument of hyperrealism?
Hyperrealism is a good word. I do not know of any. As far as I can tell, there's absolutely no response to his presentation of the Skiascope. It goes nowhere. I would guess that artists would approve of his general way of thinking about things. It is saying the goal of the museum is to make it possible for the visitor to understand what is in the artist's head. And so it puts the artist on a pedestal. But nobody responds to this particular technology of seeing. So I haven't found it. Yeah.
I'm curious whether there was sort of similar questions. Did he have any contact with the anthropologist Franz Boas? Because there would have been a Clark about the same time, perhaps actually at the same time, I'm not sure my dates. But Boaz also changed the way anthropological museums started displaying, and also the philosophies behind the display, and generally moved from evolutionary displays of let's take one object and show how it changed over 100 years. And he was more interested in the historically cultural context. And of course, the question was raised in my mind because you said that he was looking at native music, which of course Boaz was responsible for the 1893 Columbian exhibition that he wrote in that. So I'm wondering if they
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I didn't know that they would completely disagree. So Gilman works for a while at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, at Harvard's Anthropology Museum.
And so does Boaz, but they may not be
So he's there, so I will check on that. But that's where he does this work on primitive music. He discusses at some length how art museums are different from all other museums. The people that he's responding to, the other museum philosophers at the time, are G. Brown Goode at the Smithsonian, who talks about the museums for the people and evolutionary displays and teaching collections. In some ways,
Boaz hates good.
right. And then the other one who's so important at the time is Charles Catton-Dana at the Newark Museum, who is all about museums for the people. Don't spend your money on buying expensive art. Put the art from the immigrants on display. And Dana has become back into fashion in a big way. He sounds very, very modern to museum people today. Gilman basically says none of that stuff written about natural history museums or anthropology museums or technology museums has any application to art museums. Well and good, but it's not what I'm interested in, and we are all about the art. We are not about that other kind of cultural context or putting things into the right order and telling stories. We are about letting you look at individual pieces of art. So that's the big debate going on at the time. And Gilman is very much on a fringe of it. I think he wins in the art museum world, but then disappears. So, other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on that you have this idea that the walls should be a grayish-green color. Do you know why that was the color that he chose, and then why he decided on white later on?
So I'm fascinated by somebody should write a book on the history of colors that museum walls should be. Because curators have very strong feelings about this. I do not know why the grayish green, but he describes the way it relaxes the eyes or something. I don't know exactly what that means. There's a wonderful artwork. I can't remember the artist. It's a piece from the 1980s called MoMA White, which is a display of bottles of paint that different curators at MoMA wanted the walls of their galleries to be, and they're all different. And we think of there's white galleries. It turns out even in the white gallery, there are strong feelings about what really is the right white, even inside of one museum. Can't remember the name of the artist. But there's other artists who want the walls to be dark colors, other curators, and it would be fascinating to pull that together, because my guess is you could do a whole history of color theory out of that. Gray-green seems an unlikely color for me, and but let's see, I think I cut out the description of it, but he has a particular reason in mind that it's something to do with the way it relaxes the eyes. And if actually the slides, if you talk to real art historians, the gray background for the slides that you're showing is very important. I haven't quite figured out the right colors, but I know it's a heated topic among art historians when they show pictures.
Actually, Walmart adopted the same theory.
Really?
Yeah.
On gray-green. Okay. Well, there you go. It must be scientific then. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting near the end of your paper where you made the transition to look at the Skiascope as almost like an analog for the triumph of certain vision in museums. And I'm not sure if analog is the right way to phrase it, but it stands in for a type of experience. And one of the things I find interesting is the way in which now when you read about, where you see pictures of people viewing the Mona Lisa, all phones are up. All the phones are in the air, so everybody looks through the device. And it's not just that is kind of like an anecdote, but more and more museums are trying to find ways to allow phones to be part of the experience. I'm wondering, is that, because part of that analog is that isolation of the experience, and the community gets lost, but you're so stuck with the technology is mediating your vision. Does a phone intensify the experience of the Skiascope almost to an inflated or just incredible, or is there some kind of element?
Yeah, I would read it differently. I would read the phone as a way of making it more social. That basically you're sharing it with your friends. So part of that is you take a selfie and you share it. I've now see people walking through museums with their phone using FaceTime or something where they're basically broadcasting live to friends back home. Look what I'm seeing now, look what I'm seeing. So you're part of this community that doesn't happen to be the people immediately around you, but is your Facebook followers. And it's a different way of building a social community inside the museum. It's the way I would read that. But it is a technological mediation of what you're seeing. And I guess the difference with the phone thing is that you can use it in so many ways. So if you follow I Tweet Museums, which you should all follow on Twitter, lots of people see more closely because you take close-ups of things. You see details that you can't see otherwise. And then again, you share them. Or you're in the picture by taking a selfie with it. So it's so flexible. The Skiascope is the opposite in some ways. The Skiascope is really, you can use it as far as I can tell, you use it in one way. Use it to narrow down your vision, both physically and philosophically. Yes?
You mentioned that he was a fan of connoisseurship, and I'm wondering if he or you have anything more to say about how the kind of singular vision of the Skiascope changed the way we think about connoisseurship, especially given that, in my mind at least, I think about it as being tied to juxtaposition and not singular.
So he has a long debate with the board of the Museum of Fine Arts about what it means to be a connoisseur. I'm not sure I can remember the details, but basically it's this. He says, he's writing to basically the chair of the board of directors, and he says, when you went to that concert last week, your reaction to that music was that of a connoisseur. So was that 10-year-old girl sitting next to you. She too, and then he adds a little caret, a little he adds a few words in pen on this typewriter. In her own way, was a connoisseur. So a connoisseur just means somebody who has deep appreciation. It doesn't necessarily mean they've gone to school, that they are an expert. It means that they appreciate things, I think. He wants you, again, you make that connection with the artist through the painting, through looking. You don't have to have studied the painting to do it. It's really more psychological, really. So that's what I think he means by connoisseur. I don't think that's what it means more generally after that. It really does mean being able to compare pieces. The furniture people take it over, really, and it becomes being able to say good, better, best for furniture, knowing the history. Connoisseur for him is really appreciating the art on its own, which may be another reason why he goes out of fashion, actually.
We have to turn this room over into a classroom. Maybe if there's further questions, as I think there are, join us over at Macintosh for a drink and some food. Maybe James, you can lead the way over there to the gallery, and maybe we can have a chance to look through the Skiascope
course.
while we're over there. Join me again in thanking Steven for work.
Thank you.